Hello, I'm Barnett Gilmer, CEO of Gulf Breeze Recovery, and I'd like to welcome you to another Beyond Addiction podcast. Today we have a special guest, Danielle Guinaugh, and she's our clinical director. And Danielle has been with us, ever since the inception of Gulf Breeze Recovery. And so, anyway, I'll let her kind of introduce herself.
As he mentioned, I'm Danielle, the clinical director with Gulf Breeze Recovery. I've had the pleasure of working with Gulf Breeze Recovery since its inception, and I've had a wonderful experience of learning and growing a ton. I've learned so much that's really helped me grow personally and professionally. Through my education, I got a master's in psychology and counseling, and then I'm now a licensed mental health counselor, and have been able to move to a space where I'm a qualified supervisor and also able to help other counselors that are wanting to learn and grow as well, and help others that are struggling with addiction. I'm a national certified counselor, and I also have a background in training with trauma and helping others with that are struggling with trauma. Personally, I've never struggled with addiction, but my mom has passed away and I've from addiction, and I've gained personal insight from that and seen really some of the struggles that the families go through, and been able to see a bit of the innocence in addiction and how it's truly not personal.
And so today we're going to talk about substitution. And basically what I mean by that is that it's fairly common when a person maybe stops using drugs or alcohol, that they substitute that addiction maybe for something else. And the addiction doesn't have to be, the substitution doesn't have to be a drug or an alcohol. It could be shopping, sex, work. I mean, you name it. There's just a host of addictions out there. And so I'd like to explore, why that happens, and maybe also discuss possibly the antidote, to prevent that from happening. And so, one of the common traits, that a person has a lot of times when they're wanting to maybe quit, using drugs, alcohol, is that they'll have maybe a mindset or a thought pattern about I'm not going to use today. I'm not going to use today. I'm not going to drink today. And on the surface it kind of makes sense. Okay, yeah. I like to call it the not doingness. Okay, of using drugs or alcohol. And so, yeah, over and over, I'm not going to use, but unfortunately, a lot of times, most of the time, it just doesn't work. And that's because, it's, if I was to tell somebody, don't think of a pink elephant, whatever you do, don't think of a pink elephant, do not think of a pink elephant. I'm not going to think of a pink elephant. Well, that's what we think of. And so it's there, and in the not doingness of something, just it's what I like to call maybe a white knuckling process, if you will, of stop using. And so there is a better way, and maybe a different way, let's put it that way. And that's maybe a way that we can kind of look into the core reason as to why a person maybe developed a drug or an alcohol problem in the first place. Okay? And by exploring that core reason, all of a sudden, maybe a person can get enlightened, if you will, because most of the time it's blind to them about why they started, and then maybe they can have an insight or two about that, and then so the next thing you know, you're transitioning from maybe a not doingness of something to maybe a doingness, and that is a doingness of living maybe a happier, more fulfilled life. And so, maybe Danielle, you could, maybe go into detail a little bit about maybe some of the core reasons, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so we see addiction as innocently looking outside yourself to feel good. And we can do this with lots of different things. As Barnett mentioned, we can do this with sex, with drugs, with alcohol, with shopping, with money, and thinking that once we have this thing that we're going to feel some sense of relief, or this is the thing that's creating our happiness. But what we often see is that ego is never satiated, that thing, while we get temporary relief, that thing isn't sustainable, it doesn't last. And so then it just looks like we need more of that thing, and it looks like that's the thing. And so when we feel discomfort, when we feel upset or stressed, we look to this thing, and then we look to this thing and have a little bit more. So maybe we had a hard day at work, and so we come home, we have a glass of wine and relax, and that looks like that makes us feel better. And then, after doing that for a while, maybe it looks like we need just a little bit more of that. But so to me, with addiction, I think we can get a bad rap with substances and with, maybe drugs or alcohol, because they have different consequences. But how many people come home and they binge watch Netflix, or they check out, or, I've seen marriages destroyed over video games where people just kind of totally tune out, ignore their family, and they're looking for some kind of altered state that they feel like they don't have the inner resources to be present and to sit with themselves and to deal with what's happening. And what we want to show people is their own strength, their own health, their own wellness, and that they can go within, and that's where the happiness is. That's where the peace and contentment is. And that little bit of anxiety or depression or stress that looks like that they can't handle, they actually have the inner resources, and if they can be present for that for a moment, it's only temporary and it'll pass. And that's, just merely, our thinking in the moment and what's happening presently, but that will heal itself or move on its own. There's nothing that we have to do, and we don't need this thing outside of us. We don't need to alter our own state. We don't need to change what's happening. That we really have this health and wellness within us that we just don't see, that we don't recognize. And what I see when people come into treatment is they're so afraid to look within. They're so afraid of what they'll see. They're so afraid that of who they really are, of seeing who they really are. But if they could see what we see in their eyes, if they could see the health and light that we can see within them, and they begin to see that. As they see that for themselves, by nature they're happier, and the addiction no longer makes sense to them.
Yeah, so really what I'm hearing, Danielle, is that, the drugs, the alcohol, the whatever it is outside that a person's looking for is they almost found a solution, right?
Right.
Innocently. Yeah. And so innocently, because, let's just call it the wine, it was a solution, relax me, whatever. And so, just a natural tendency is to keep going back to it.
Sure, because it works.
Yeah. And the problem comes into play is when all of a sudden, the alcohol itself becomes a source of a bigger problem. And that's what we call the cycle of addiction is, you take the drug, you feel better, then you start feeling worse, and so now you got to take the drug or the alcohol to feel better. And so you're in this cycle, and most people, when they're in this cycle, they wake up. One day they just kind of wake up and they go, oh my gosh, how did I get here? How did this happen? Because it sneaks up on them. And so when that happens, then maybe the concentration of what I like to call the not doingness, I don't know if that's grammatically correct, but the not doingness of using comes in. Would you mind putting up the plant display. And so, in some of our other podcasts, we had the plant analogy, and so basically, the plant that you see, we called it the observable behavior of addiction, and and then the roots here, were the what we call the internal unrest, if you will. And it could be a host of different things, whether it be depression, anxiety, whatever it may be, for the individual. And then of course the soil, what the soil represented was the outside in misunderstanding of where our completion, our happiness, our fulfillment, whatever you want to call it, comes from. And so, we're naturally looking outside ourselves, for that completion. That's kind of, what a lot of us were brought up to do. And so, as long as we have this outside-in misunderstanding, and we have, whatever the internal unrest is, insecurity is also a good one. Then the not doingness of drugs and alcohol is like chopping this plant off. Okay. And so, with that, the temporary observable behaviors cease, and but unfortunately, for many of us, the plant grows back. And when I say the plant, we'll just call it addiction. We won't call it what kind of addiction, but maybe a substitution maybe takes place, whether it be another drug or so. And so, this internal unrest, that's one of the core things that we have to work on, and of course also helping our guests to see the innocence of the outside-in misunderstanding, where life comes from, or where happiness comes from.
A lot of people think that, if I have more money or if I have this job, that happiness will come once they have this thing. And what they don't see is that innocently they're putting their happiness out there, and they're losing this present moment. And they're always looking ahead to the future, to the next thing, or when I have this, then I'll be happy. But what we want people to see is that in this presence, that there's happiness now, and that they can be content now, and it's not contingent on all these things. And once they really see that, there's a freeness that happens, where you naturally feel better because you aren't always waiting until the next big thing. Now, certainly still we have goals and things that we want for ourselves, but we see that we don't have to put our happiness way out there on those things, and that we can be peaceful and content with what's happening right now. And I think a big part of our program that's helpful is people have so identified with addiction, thinking that this thing is their happiness, that we help them to be present and to see, well, I can enjoy my life now. Even being in treatment, I can enjoy treatment, and I can find things that I benefit from and enjoy, and new hobbies and activities, and that I can enjoy this process, and that it's not nearly as scary as I thought it was to see kind of the source of my own discomfort, and that there's no longer a need to numb that discomfort anymore.
We all experience discomfort, there's no doubt about it. But having an understanding that, the discomfort is part of life, and that it always passes. It always passes. And so what's a really crazy concept, if you will, not really, but can seem that way sometimes, is that in our world of doing this, so I go back to that, we don't have to do anything. So when we're experiencing discomfort, we experience it. Okay? It's not a bad thing. It's part of life. And so we experience it. We don't have to do anything about it, because the act sometimes of trying to do something about it is what can get us in trouble. And that act being, I got to feel better. I got to look outside myself to feel better. And so maybe I've quit drinking. I've quit using drugs. So, maybe I need to turn to shopping. If I buy myself some nice stuff, I feel better at that moment. And of course, next thing you know, you're broke because you got a lot of belongings and no money in the bank, or gambling or whatever.
And wouldn't you say that our society lends itself to that, like the consumerism, the you need this thing now, the instant gratification, take this pill and you'll be happy, or almost the idea that we're not supposed to feel uncomfortable, or we need things so that we don't feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's our okayness, if you will, is dependent on whatever it may be, a pill, or talking about consumerism. We spoke about that in an earlier podcast even, that we are raised, if you will, as children, to believe that if we have this certain toy, that maybe our life will be a little happier, a little more fun. And then kind of grow up in that belief, kind of probably more for most of us on a subconscious level. But yeah, no, I agree with you that the society kind of lends itself to that. Working with our guests, and of course working with therapists who work with our guests. Do you have any examples, maybe what I'm talking about, or?
Well, what I think I really want people to see, and what I saw so deeply for myself, is that innocence of addiction, and how I think most all of us do it in some way with just different consequences, right? How all of us can feel like we had a really tough day and we just really want to disconnect from what's going on and check out. And we find lots of different ways to check out. And with drugs and alcohol, I think you've got different consequences with that. And, you also have a stigmatism with that. But how many people in this country are addicted to food, and they binge eat, and they get, so overweight, and they have medical consequences, but we don't judge that in the way that we judge drugs and alcohol. Or how many people are shopaholics, and they've even got themselves and their families into debt, or they're really stuck, but we don't look at that the way that we look at drugs and alcohol. That kind of has a different connotation. And so I think the people that struggle with drugs and alcohol often get this idea like, I'm bad, something's wrong with me, I'm broken, I have a disease, this isn't fixable, I'm going to have this for the rest of my life. But meanwhile, other people are innocently, engaging in activities that just aren't helpful either, with different consequences. And so to me, it's just like, well, I'm not any better or worse than you. It's just my blind spot, or the area which I maybe check out, is just a little different than yours. And so, seeing the innocence, and that we're all human beings and we're all into this together, and that we all struggle and we all suffer at times. And, the less that we judge ourselves and the less that we judge other people, the more it leads to healing and insight. The longer that we stay caught up judging, the further away we get from the solution.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. You mentioned something about overeating, and one of the things that we've noticed at the center is that, so we can look at substitution, let's look at it the other way around, okay? And that is that people will come to the center who have maybe experienced a gastric bypass surgery, okay? Innocently, once again, their solution has been taken away from them, okay? And that solution being, food, that finding comfort in eating. And so maybe they find alcohol. And so next thing you know, over a period maybe a few years or whatever, they develop an alcohol problem. And that's just such a classic example of substitution. But on the other, maybe the other end, instead of, drugs and alcohol, then substituting to something else, it's eating and then substituting for alcohol.
Yeah, when I was in college, I had to do a paper and go to AA classes and Overeaters Anonymous, and so then I had to write about my experiences. And every person in the Overeaters Anonymous group that I went to had struggled with some kind of alcohol or drug addiction. That was just so powerful to me, how innocently we change from one thing to another. Even in some of the therapies in school, they kind of teach you a substitution, or we're going to do this instead of this. And so it's almost like we're conditioned. And at times maybe that can be helpful, but to see the bigger picture and to have the insight that we don't have to substitute this thing to give ourselves this relief, that the relief comes from within, is so much more powerful.
In this, just one more point on the substitution. We have a lot of people that come through the center, and we work with them on this. Is my problem is heroin. It's never been alcohol. So when I go home, I'm gonna drink, or maybe smoke pot or whatever, and then of course, maybe some follow through with that idea, and then of course develop a drinking problem. It's just always, it's a substitution. And so, what can we do about that? All right, what's the, I don't know, maybe lack of a better word, but what's the antidote, for substitution? What's that core underlying thing that we need to help a person with that ultimately prevents the need for substitution?
Well, I think like we've been talking about, part of it is seeing that it's okay to be uncomfortable, and that if you move through the discomfort, you get relief. And that's how we grow, right? When we think about how we grow and we change, when you got a toddler that's learning how to walk, they're not worried about, the fact that they fell. They get right back up. They brush it off, right? And it's not a big deal. And they even look to us for our reaction. Like, if you see the toddler fall and they go, and you go, oh no, and then they like start to cry, right, where maybe they wouldn't have. It's almost this learned behavior that, hey, it's not okay to fall down, or hey, it's not okay to have a bad day or to feel okay. It's like we make too much of that, just to see that, hey, this will pass, it's okay. And that, we can learn from that and grow and move forward. But you don't get through change without some form of discomfort. You don't learn and grow, and then you stay stagnant, right? And when you stay stagnant, that feels uncomfortable. If I stay in this chair and I don't move, my body's going to give me some feedback that my leg's fallen asleep or I feel numb. It's letting me know, hey, this isn't really comfortable, this isn't working. But I could sit here and I could take something so that I'm numb, so that I don't feel that feedback that my body's given me that tells me to get up and move, right? So often we're getting that feedback and we're just misinterpreting what that feedback is. Maybe we're misinterpreting the anxiety. The anxiety is a resistance of the emotion in the moment. The anxiety is coming up and saying, hey, there's something we want you to tend to. And what we innocently do is think that we have to ignore it and suppress it and not look at it. And quite the opposite is what's really going to give us the relief.
Yeah, so I think, the internal unrest, the roots, if you will, is definitely one of the core issues, that we have to deal with. And I think probably maybe the biggest issue that we have to deal with, with internal unrest, is insecurity. And the blind thinking, if you will, that comes with insecurity. And, what do I mean by blind thinking? And how I interpret it is that, maybe the feeling of inadequacy or not being enough or whatever it may be, that maybe drives some people, okay? And so, they're just, which leads to that, as the soil here, that outside in search, if you will, for that completion. And so if we can help a person to insightfully see, okay, what really maybe is driving the ship, you know, what's really going on here, and if we can help them to have, you know, kind of an aha moment, an insight, whatever you want to call it, you know, about what's driving the ship, then all of a sudden things start to change for them. You know, they start to see maybe the world through a different lens. Okay. When they start to understand that, you know, happiness, contentment, peace is always an inside-out process, never an outside-in. And they insightfully see it. You know, it's one thing to, you know, to maybe have an intellectual understanding about it, but to really see it for what it is. Yeah, things start to change, and when that happens, when a person starts to have that feeling maybe of serenity or peace or whatever, then all of a sudden the need to do external things start to maybe not make sense anymore to them. And I don't know if that makes any sense or not.
Yeah,
But,
of course. Yeah. Well, when you see that your peace, your happiness, and your contentment comes from within, it no longer makes sense to look without. It no longer makes sense to use substances. We've even had instances where maybe somebody's come to treatment and then they've, you know, used a substance after they left, and they went, oh man, it just doesn't even feel the same. I don't even have the same effect from this I used to get. Or we joke it's kind of like the Santa Claus effect. Once you see there's no Santa Claus, you have a different viewpoint. It just doesn't make, you know, things don't make sense anymore to do them like you were doing them, because you see something different. And if you see that you can take a shortcut to work and it's only a half an hour instead of an hour, then it doesn't make sense to drive an hour to work anymore.
yeah. And, you know, and it's funny because what we're talking about is basically, once again, and we've talked about this in other podcasts, is you know, kind of making the soil here fallow, and you know, changing an outside-in misunderstanding to maybe an inside-out understanding, and so yeah, the soil becomes fallow. And so instead of the not doingness of drugs and alcohol, we're cutting the head of the plant off. The doingness of seeing things differently, the whole plant starts to die and wither away. And you know, that's the beauty, in my opinion, about what we try to point people to. Because it does enable them, when they see that, to not have to substitute. Because, you know, substitution's a big thing. I mean, it's a huge issue, you know, in most treatment settings.
Yeah. So, you know, the way we see addiction is that that's not the problem. Most people look at that as, okay, this is the problem and we're going to fix it. And, you know, you can get some resolution in that and people stop using substances, but often what you see when you focus on addiction as just the problem is that you don't resolve the underlying issues. And when we don't resolve the underlying issues, people aren't happy. They're not joyful. They're not enjoying their life. They don't feel connected. And so they either live their life, you know, without doing this thing and feeling like they're really giving up something, and they're still unhappy or miserable, which often can lead back to using substances again, or can just lead to a life where you feel like you're missing out and you're not going to have that peace and contentment. But the way we look at it is just that the addiction is just a symptom. It's a symptom of things that are going on that are deeper. It's a symptom of the fact that we're thinking that this peace, contentment, and happiness is outside of us, or it's a symptom of thinking that we can't handle the distress level that's going on. It's a symptom of thinking that we have to fix this thing, that it's not okay to feel sad, that it's not okay to feel angry or discontentment. And so, we obviously want people to know that you don't necessarily act on that space, that you don't have to act on it, but the fact that you're feeling it or experiencing it there's nothing wrong with that. We're not robots. We're not meant to feel happy all the time. We're not meant to, just kind of flatline through life. We go up and down. And that's what can bring us more joy and more happiness and contentment, because we're not so afraid of the times when life falls, because we know that we can handle it. We know that we have that strength and resilience. And when we are really happy, we can enjoy that and not be so afraid of losing it. I see often where people are almost afraid to feel happy and joy, and when they do, they take a few steps back because it's like, I'm waiting on the other shoe to drop. And it's almost like sometimes they sabotage that. It's, I'm going to control crash landing the plane because then I have control of when I lose this happiness. And so again, just an innocent misunderstanding, that fear that, if we live life really happy and full of joy, that I can't control when something happens. But it's the fact that we know that we have the resources no matter what life throws at us that really gives us the most peace.
And I think that at the end of the day, that we'll be okay. That we're going to be okay. One thing I want to kind of end with is that we're certainly by no means wanting to minimize, the harmful effects of drug and alcohol addiction. I mean, it's devastating. People are, dying out there from it. It's a deadly illness, and but what we want to say is that it's not who a person really is, even though it seems like it, through all the behaviors and, manipulations and everything else associated with it. It's not who a person is, that there's so much more to an individual. It's something that a person, is doing, and the actions, that a person takes while in the throes of addiction are things that they've done, but it's by far not who they are. And, we want to point people to and rediscover, we want them to rediscover who they really are. Because if they can do that, all of it, it's... the world changes for them. It's just amazing, what can happen. And we've seen it, right?
Right, I have.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like when you have the flu and you're so sick and all you want is to feel better, maybe you got a stomach bug and you just feel horrible, you can't get out of bed. Well, so many people with addiction, they face that every day. Their bones ache, they're shaking, they're, violently ill. And so innocently in the moment, the best they know is to get that substance so that they can temporarily get a little bit of relief. And as they feel better and they come to treatment, they look back and they go, man, how could I have done this for so long? How could I have done all this damage? But, when we are so desperate and so sick and stuck, that's the best we know. And so, we've got a wonderful detox program that helps people move through that in a more comfortable way, and to be able to get healthy and to get to a better level of awareness or consciousness where it no longer makes sense to do that.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think that about wraps it up, for this topic. Danielle, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And hope to see you again on our next podcast, our next Beyond Addiction podcast. And thanks for joining.